My life, as I see it now from the quiet vantage of these later years, hasn't been a grand, sweeping story. There were no cinematic moments, no dramatic pronouncements under a stormy sky. It has been more like a piece of cloth, woven thread by tiny thread, day by day, in a room where the windows were gradually painted over from the outside. The pattern of my life was not one I chose, but one that emerged from the choices of others and from my own silent compliance. It began with love, as so many of these quiet tragedies do. A love I believed was a foundation of granite, but which proved, over 40 long years, to be nothing more than sand. I remember a particular Tuesday, just a few years ago. It feels like a lifetime away now, but it was the day one of the final, load-bearing threads snapped. It was autumn in Ohio, the air crisp and smelling of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. Richard, my husband, had lost his car keys. A simple, everyday annoyance. But in our house, simple annoyances were never simple. They were kindling for a fire that was always smoldering just beneath the floorboards. He didn't ask, "Margaret, have you seen my keys?" He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his large frame filling it completely, and declared, "You've moved my keys." It wasn't a question. It was an indictment. I was at the sink, my hands submerged in warm, soapy water, washing the breakfast dishes. It was a ritual so ingrained in me that I could do it in my sleep. Plate, fork, glass, pan. The same sequence, every single day for 40 years. I didn't turn around. I could feel his gaze on my back, hot and impatient. "I haven't touched your keys, Richard," I said, my voice calm, a practiced, artificial calm that I had perfected over decades. It was the voice of a hostage negotiator, speaking to the captor she also had to live with. "Don't lie to me, Margaret," he said, his voice low and rumbling. "They were on the hall table. They are always on the hall table. You and your infernal tidying. You tidy things into oblivion." My hands stopped moving in the water. I could see the reflection of the kitchen window in the bubbles on the surface. I saw the maple tree in the backyard, its leaves a brilliant, defiant red against a pale blue sky. It was beautiful. A perfect, beautiful day that I was not a part of. I was in this room with this man, accused of a crime I did not commit. I pulled my hands from the water, dried them on the faded floral tea towel hanging from the oven door, and turned to face him. "I will help you look for them," I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the knot of his tie. Looking him in the eye during these moments was like staring into the sun. It only blinded you. We searched. Or rather, I searched while he followed me from room to room, a thunderous cloud of silent accusation. I checked my apron pockets, the countertop where the mail was stacked, the mantelpiece above the fireplace. He stood with his arms crossed, sighing with theatrical impatience. Finally, I went to his study, a room that was his sanctuary and my forbidden territory. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, bitter smell of his cigars. And there, on his cluttered desk, nestled between a stack of financial reports and a half-empty coffee mug, were the keys. I didn't say, "Here they are, right where you left them." I didn't point out his error. 40 years of marriage had taught me that his victory was paramount. His rightness was the pillar that held up the ceiling of our home. To challenge it was to risk bringing the whole structure down upon my head. I simply picked them up, walked back to the hall, and placed them in his outstretched hand. He snatched them from my palm. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say, "Oh, my mistake." He looked at me, his eyes cold and gray as a winter lake, and said, "See? If you just put things back where they belong, we wouldn't have to go through this whole performance." And then he left. The front door clicked shut behind him, and the house fell into a profound silence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic, useless beating of my own heart. I walked back to the kitchen sink and leaned against it, my legs suddenly weak. I looked at my hands, the skin puckered from the water, the knuckles slightly swollen with the beginnings of arthritis. These hands had raised 2 children, cooked 10,000 meals, cleaned this house until it shone. These hands had held him when his father died, had nursed him through the flu, had ironed his shirts for every important meeting of his career. And yet, in his eyes, they were the hands of a saboteur, a clumsy meddler who moved his keys. That was the moment the sand shifted beneath my feet. Not in a great, dramatic landslide, but in a small, sickening slide that told me the foundation was finally, irrevocably gone. I stood there for a long time, staring out at that beautiful, burning red maple tree, and I realized I wasn't just tired. I was hollow. The woman I was supposed to be, the bright, laughing girl who had fallen in love with a handsome, ambitious young man, was gone. She had been misplaced, like a set of car keys, and I had no idea where to even begin to look for her. We had met at a university dance. It seems so cliché now, like a scene from an old black and white film. I was studying literature, dreaming of becoming a writer or a teacher. He was in the business program, all sharp angles and confidence, with a 5-year plan already mapped out in his head. He told me I was the most beautiful girl in the room. He said my laugh was like music. He listened, or seemed to listen, when I talked about a poem by Keats or a novel by Virginia Woolf. He made me feel seen. For a girl who had always felt a little invisible, that was a powerful intoxicant. We married a year after graduation. My dreams of a career were gently, lovingly set aside. "We'll be a team," Richard said, holding me close in the tiny, sun-drenched apartment we first rented. "You'll build the nest, and I'll go out and conquer the world for us." It sounded so romantic, so noble. I would be the keeper of the hearth, the creator of a sanctuary he could return to from the harshness of the world. It felt like an important job, a sacred trust. I packed away my books and my ambitions along with my wedding dress, and I dedicated myself to him. The first few years were fine. They were a blur of setting up our first real home, a modest bungalow on a street lined with young, hopeful trees. I learned to cook his mother's recipes. I learned to budget the housekeeping money he gave me each week in a crisp envelope. It was my allowance, he called it, with a little chuckle, as if it were a charming game we were playing. I didn't question it. It was the way things were done. All the other wives on our street had a similar arrangement. We were partners, but he was the senior partner. The first cracks appeared subtly. I had always loved painting. Watercolors. Nothing serious, just small landscapes of the park or portraits of our cat. I had a little corner set up in the spare bedroom. One day, Richard came home early from work and found me there, lost in the wash of blues and greens on the paper. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway. Then he said, "It's a nice little hobby, I suppose. Just be sure not to get any paint on the carpet." The way he said hobby was like a pat on the head. It was dismissive. It relegated my passion, the one thing that was truly mine, to the level of a child's pastime. From that day on, whenever I picked up a brush, I felt a little foolish, a little self-indulgent. The joy began to seep out of it, replaced by a quiet sense of shame. Then our son, Daniel, was born. And 2 years later, our daughter, Sarah. My life became consumed by them, and I was grateful for it. They were a beautiful, wonderful distraction. Their needs were clear and honest. A scraped knee needed a bandage and a kiss. A hungry belly needed a warm meal. A frightened heart needed a lullaby. There was no subtext, no hidden meaning. My love for them was pure and uncomplicated. It filled up the spaces inside me that were beginning to feel empty. Richard was a proud father, but a distant one. He saw the children as future accomplishments. Daniel was his heir, the one who would carry on his name and, he hoped, his business acumen. Sarah was his princess, to be protected and admired for her beauty. He provided for them lavishly. The best schools, the nicest clothes, the most expensive toys. But he was not present. He was a photograph on the mantelpiece, a booming voice from the doorway at 6:30 every evening, a rustling newspaper at the breakfast table. The work of raising them, the day-to-day, grinding, relentless, glorious work, was mine alone. The fevers in the night, the parent-teacher conferences, the carpools, the homework help, the broken hearts over playground squabbles. I was the hub of our family's wheel, and everyone else, Richard included, were the spokes, radiating out from me but never truly connecting with each other. It was exhausting, but it was also my identity. I was Margaret, wife of Richard, mother of Daniel and Sarah. I didn't exist outside of those roles. As Richard's career soared, Our house got bigger, the cars got newer, and the distance between us grew wider. He became a man who was respected in the community. He was on the board of the local bank. He was the president of the country club. People would stop me in the grocery store and say, "You must be so proud of Richard." And I was. But the man they saw, the charming, confident community leader, was a stranger to me. The man I lived with was silent, critical, and perpetually disappointed. His disappointment was a constant, low-grade hum in our lives. The roast was slightly overcooked. The lawn wasn't green enough. I had gained a few pounds. Daniel wasn't aggressive enough on the soccer field. Sarah was too sensitive. He had a way of delivering his criticisms that was surgically precise. He never raised his voice. He would just make a quiet observation, a suggestion for improvement, that would slice right through you and leave you bleeding internally. "Margaret, that dress is a very bold color, isn't it?" he'd say, as I was getting ready for a company dinner, a dinner where I was expected to stand by his side and smile, a perfect accessory to his success. And just like that, the dress I had felt pretty in moments before would feel garish and cheap. I would feel like a fool. "You're emotional, Margaret," he'd say, whenever I tried to talk to him about a problem, about my feelings of loneliness, about the growing chasm between us. "You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Things are fine. We have a beautiful home, healthy children, no financial worries. What on earth do you have to be unhappy about?" He was the gaslighter in chief, and I was his most loyal subject. I started to believe him. What did I have to be unhappy about? I had everything a woman was supposed to want. I was lucky. My feelings of sadness and isolation must be a character flaw, a personal failing. I was ungrateful. I was overly emotional. So I learned to stop talking. I learned to swallow my feelings, to push them down into a dark, deep place inside me until I could barely feel them anymore. The silence in our house grew, and I became a part of it. The children were my lifeline. With them, I could still be the person I was meant to be. I could be warm and loving and silly. I could laugh. We had our own little world, a bubble that existed within the larger, colder world of the house. We'd bake cookies and make a huge mess in the kitchen, and I'd hurry to clean it all up before Richard got home. We'd read books aloud on the sofa, cuddled under a blanket, our voices whispering so as not to disturb him in his study. We were co-conspirators in the business of finding joy in a joyless place. But children grow up. It is their job. And as they grew, the influence of their father began to seep into our bubble. Daniel, ever eager for his father's approval, started to adopt some of his mannerisms. He became more pragmatic, more dismissive of what he called mom's fussing. He loved me, I know he did, but he began to see me through his father's eyes, as a domestic utility, necessary but not particularly important. Once, when Daniel was in high school, he was struggling with an English paper. I, the former literature student, sat with him for hours, helping him brainstorm, structure his arguments, and polish his prose. I loved it. It was like finding a long-lost part of myself. He got an A on the paper. When he brought it home, he walked right past me in the kitchen and went to Richard's study. I heard him through the door. "Dad, I got an A." And I heard Richard's pleased, rumbling reply, "Good man. That's my boy. Hard work pays off." Daniel never mentioned my help. It was as if it hadn't happened. I stood in the kitchen, holding a wooden spoon, and felt myself disappear. Sarah was different. She was my ally, my confidant. She had my sensitivity and a fierce, protective streak. She saw what was happening. She saw the way he treated me. When she was a teenager, she started to challenge him, to stand up for me. "Dad, don't talk to Mom like that," she'd say, her voice trembling but firm. But her interventions only made things worse. Richard would turn his cold fury on her, telling her she was disrespectful, that she didn't understand the adult world. And afterward, when we were alone, he would turn on me. "You see what you've done?" he'd say, his voice a venomous whisper. "You've turned her against me. You've poisoned her with your melodrama." It was another crime I was guilty of, the alienation of my own daughter. So I begged Sarah to stop. "Please, darling, don't," I'd whisper to her in the hallway. "It's okay. I'm fine. You're just making it harder." I taught my own daughter to be silent, just as I had been taught. It is the greatest shame of my life. The day Sarah left for college was the day the bubble burst for good. We loaded her car, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. Daniel was already gone, living in a city 2 states away, starting his career in finance, a smaller, shinier version of his father. When Sarah hugged me goodbye, she held on for a long time. She whispered in my ear, "You don't have to stay here, Mom. You know that, right?" I just smiled a watery, brittle smile and said, "Don't be silly. This is my home." I watched her drive away, down our quiet, perfect street, until her car was just a tiny speck. Then I went back inside the house. It was immaculate, spotless, and it was silent. The silence was no longer just the absence of noise. It was a physical presence. It was a thick, heavy blanket that smothered everything. For the first time, there was no buffer. There were no children's projects to focus on, no school events to plan, no teenage dramas to mediate. There was just me and Richard and 40 years of unspoken words filling all the air between us. That evening, we sat in the living room. He was reading the Wall Street Journal, and I was pretending to read a novel, the same page for half an hour. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from his parents, ticked away the seconds. Each tick felt like a drop of water on stone, slowly, patiently eroding what was left of me. I looked at him over the top of my book. His hair was mostly gray now, and the lines around his mouth had deepened. He was a stranger to me. A familiar, comfortable, terrifying stranger. Did he feel this emptiness too? Did he notice that the life we had built was now just an empty stage set? I cleared my throat. A small, nervous sound. "It's quiet, isn't it?" I said. He rustled his paper, a sign of irritation. He lowered it just enough so I could see his eyes. "It's peaceful," he said. And that was it. The conversation was over. My expression of shared loss was, to him, a disruption of his peace. I was, as always, the problem. That night, I lay in our large, cold bed, staring into the darkness. Richard was asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. He was untroubled. I felt a wave of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a very long time. It wasn't sadness. It was rage. A hot, searing rage that rose up from that deep, dark place where I had buried all my feelings. It was rage for the girl who loved poetry, for the young woman who loved to paint, for the mother who had to teach her daughter to be quiet, for the wife who was made to feel like a trespasser in her own life. I thought about the house, this beautiful prison I had so meticulously maintained. Every polished floor, every dust-free surface, every perfectly plumped cushion was a testament to my servitude. I had poured my entire life, my entire being into this house, and in return, it had consumed me. It was a mausoleum, and I was the ghost who haunted it. The incident with the keys happened about a year after that. It was not the biggest cruelty I had suffered, nor the smallest. It was just the one that happened to land on a crack that was already splintering. It was the final, careless tap on a pane of glass that was ready to shatter. As I stood at the sink after he left, the silence roaring in my ears, I knew something had to change. I didn't know what. I didn't know how. I had no money of my own, no real-world skills, no friends he hadn't approved of. I was 62 years old, and I was utterly, completely trapped. Or so I thought. I walked through the silent house that day, touching things. The smooth, cool marble of the kitchen island. The rough, nubby texture of the living room sofa. The silky tassel on a curtain tieback. I was a tourist in my own life. I ended up in my daughter's old room. It was exactly as she had left it. I had preserved it, another perfect space in my perfect house. I sat on her bed and looked at the bulletin board on her wall. It was covered with photographs. Pictures of her friends, of her sports teams, of her and me, our arms around each other, squinting in the sun. And in the very center of the board, held by a single pink thumbtack, was a small, folded piece of paper. A fortune from a fortune cookie we had shared years ago at a Chinese restaurant. I remembered the day. It had been one of our secret celebratory lunches, just the two of us. I carefully pulled the thumbtack out and unfolded the tiny slip of paper. The message was simple, faded, but still clear. It said, "You have been waiting for the right time. The time is now." I sat there on my daughter's bed, in the crushing silence of my perfect home, and held that tiny piece of paper in my trembling hand. It felt heavier than a stone. It felt like a key. Not a key to a car that could be misplaced, but a key to a door I had long forgotten even existed. A door that led out. The time is now. The words echoed in the hollow space inside me, not as a command, but as a quiet, steady permission. And for the first time in a very, very long time, I began to think not about what Richard wanted or what the children needed, but about what it was that I might need for myself. And I realized with a terrifying, thrilling clarity that I had absolutely no idea. The search for that answer would be the beginning of the end of my life as I knew it. And the real beginning of me. That little slip of paper from the fortune cookie did not magically unlock my cage. It only illuminated the bars. For weeks, I lived in a strange new state of awareness, a double life played out inside my own head. On the outside, I was still Margaret Thompson, dutiful wife. I made Richard's coffee exactly as he liked it, with 1.5 spoons of sugar, stirred clockwise. I picked up his dry cleaning, I made his bed, the hospital corners crisp enough to cut paper. I performed the 1,000 small rituals of my servitude with the same placid efficiency as always. But on the inside, a revolution was brewing. A quiet, terrified, exhilarating mutiny. Every action was now filtered through the lens of my newfound clarity. As I polished the gleaming silver of the cutlery, a wedding gift from my long-dead parents, I no longer saw a family heirloom. I saw a symbol of the countless formal, joyless dinners I had served and cleared away. As I folded Richard's laundered shirts, I felt the fine, expensive cotton and thought not of his success, but of the way the fabric would feel against his chest as he sat in judgment of me. The house was no longer my home, it was my post. And I was a soldier preparing to go AWOL. The fortune cookie's words, "The time is now," became a silent mantra. But now was an abstract concept. I was 62 years old. I hadn't had a paying job since I was a 21-year-old university student working in the campus library. My resume was a 40-year blank space, filled only with the invisible ink of domestic labor. My name was on the deed to the house, but I had no independent access to our money. The accounts were all in Richard's name, with me listed as a dependent, a beneficiary, but not a partner. The weekly housekeeping allowance he gave me was always just enough for groceries and small household expenses, with little left over. He called it fiscal responsibility. I now understood it was a leash. So I began my first true act of rebellion. I started skimming. It felt both shameful and thrilling. When I went to the grocery store, I would use coupons I'd secretly clipped, then pocket the difference. I'd buy the store brand flour instead of the premium brand he preferred, and carefully pour it into the old, familiar canister. $1 here, 50 cents there. It was paltry, but it was mine. I found an old shoebox in the back of the guest room closet, a room that hadn't seen a guest in years. I lined it with a soft, worn-out cashmere scarf I no longer wore, and I began to build my escape fund. I called it my egg money, a phrase my grandmother used to use for the secret cash she kept from selling eggs from her hens. Every time I placed a crumpled dollar bill or a handful of coins into that box, my heart would pound with a mixture of fear and defiance. That shoebox became the most precious object in the entire house. It held not just money, it held a possibility. During the days when Richard was at the office or the club, I began my research. I felt like a spy in enemy territory. I didn't dare use the computer in his study. He was meticulous about checking the browser history. He called it protecting our network security. I saw it for what it was. So I started going to the public library. The same library I used to take Daniel and Sarah to for story time. It felt strange to be there for myself, a solitary woman with graying hair, sitting at a public computer terminal, the sticky keys and the hum of the old monitor a world away from the sleek, silent laptop in Richard's study. I typed in phrases that felt alien on my tongue, even in my thoughts. Jobs for older women with no experience. Affordable one-bedroom apartments. How to open a bank account with no starting funds. The search results were a sobering cascade of reality. The jobs were in retail, fast food, cleaning services. The apartments were in neighborhoods I had only ever driven through with the car doors locked. The world outside my manicured suburban street was hard and unforgiving. Doubt, cold and heavy, would settle in my stomach. Was I crazy? Was Richard right? Was I just being emotional, ungrateful? I would look at the shoebox, now holding a little over $200, and the flimsy paper bills would seem like a child's play money against the granite fortress of my life with Richard. I knew I needed to talk to my children. I needed to know if I had allies. I called Sarah first, my heart thumping nervously. She was in graduate school, studying social work. Of all people, she would understand. I didn't tell her my plan, not directly. I was too afraid to speak it aloud. I just tested the waters. Darling, I began, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. I was just thinking. Are you happy? She was quiet for a moment. That's a big question, Mom. Yeah, I am. It's hard work, but it's mine. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, I said quickly. I was just wondering. If your father and if things weren't working out, just hypothetically. I didn't have to finish. Sarah's voice became soft, serious. Mom, are you okay? Is he being dad again? Tears sprang to my eyes. The simple validation in her tone, the fact that she knew exactly what being dad meant, was like a cool hand on a fevered brow. I'm just tired, I whispered into the phone. I told you, Mom, she said, her voice firm, the same protective fire I remembered from her teenage years. You don't have to stay. You can come here. You can stay with me. My apartment is tiny, but we'd manage. A wave of love for her washed over me, so fierce it almost buckled my knees. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't land on her doorstep, a 62-year-old refugee from a failed marriage, and derail her life just as it was beginning. She had her own struggles, her own student loans, her own future to build. I had already taught her to be quiet for my sake once. I would not make her responsible for my freedom now. Thank you, my sweet girl, I said, my voice thick with unshed tears. That means more than you know. I'm okay. I'm just thinking. The call with Daniel a few days later was different. Daniel worked for a large investment firm. He was practical, ambitious, and deeply concerned with appearances. He was Richard's son. I tried the same gentle approach. Daniel, honey, I have a strange question for you. Shoot, Mom, he said, his voice distracted. I could hear the clicking of a keyboard in the background. What would you think, I began, my mouth suddenly dry, if I told you I wasn't happy with your father? The clicking stopped. There was a long pause. What do you mean, not happy? He asked, his tone shifting from distracted to wary. Is this about the argument over the new car? Dad told me you were being a bit difficult about it. My blood ran cold. Of course. Richard had already framed the narrative. A few weeks prior, I had suggested that instead of another luxury sedan, we could perhaps get something more modest and put the savings toward a trip, maybe to see the grandchildren. He had dismissed the idea as fiscally irresponsible and childish. And he had reported my difficult behavior to our son. It's not about the car, Daniel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. It's about decades. It's about me wanting something more than this. More than what? His voice was sharp now, impatient. Mom, you have a life most people would kill for. A beautiful house, no money worries, a husband who is one of the most respected men in the community. What on earth are you talking about? Are you feeling depressed? Maybe you should see Dr. Miller. He could give you something for your nerves. My nerves. Just like Richard. I was emotional. I was the problem. He wasn't hearing me. He was diagnosing me. Daniel, I said, my voice trembling with a hurt so profound it felt like a physical blow. I'm not a patient. I'm your mother. And I'm telling you that I am deeply, profoundly unhappy. He sighed, a long, exasperated sound I knew so well. It was Richard's sigh. Mom, you're being dramatic. You're 62 years old. You can't just, what? Run away from home? What would people think? What would that do to Dad's reputation? To the family? You're just in a slump because the house is empty. Why don't you join a book club or a gardening society or something? Keep yourself busy. I hung up the phone. I didn't say goodbye. I just gently placed the receiver back in its cradle. And in that moment, something inside me hardened. The hope that I might find a soft place to land with my son was gone. He had made his allegiance clear. He was a keeper of the status quo, a guardian of his father's world. I saw with brutal clarity that my unhappiness was an inconvenience to them both, a messy problem to be managed, medicated, or ignored. Sarah's offer was love, but Daniel's response was the reality. I was completely, utterly alone in this. And it was strangely liberating. There was no one to disappoint anymore. No one to consider but myself. The decision was no longer a question of if, but when. The when came on a rainy Wednesday in November. The trigger, as always, was pathetically small. I had been to the library again, and on my way home, on a whim, I had stopped at a small, independent coffee shop and bought a bag of hazelnut-flavored coffee beans. It smelled wonderful. It was a tiny, selfish indulgence. The next morning, I made a pot of it. The rich, nutty aroma filled the kitchen. It was a smell that was mine. Richard came into the kitchen, nodding his silk tie. He poured himself a cup, took a sip, and his face contorted. He didn't spit it out, but he set the cup down on the marble island with a sharp clack that echoed in the quiet room. "What is this?" he asked, his voice flat and cold. "It's hazelnut coffee," I said, my back to him, as I placed a plate of toast on the table. "I thought we could try something different." "We don't try something different, Margaret," he said, the words spaced out, as if explaining a complex concept to a child. "I drink Colombian blend." I have drunk Colombian blend for 30 years. Is that so very difficult to remember? Something in me, the part that had been carefully packing away insults and injuries for 4 decades, finally snapped. I turned around, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. "No, Richard," I said, and my voice was calm, terrifyingly calm. "It is not difficult to remember. It is, however, excruciatingly boring." He stared at me. It was the first time in perhaps 20 years that I had contradicted him so directly. He looked at me as if I had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "I see," he said softly. "You're feeling rebellious today. First my keys, now my coffee. What's next, Margaret? Are you going to start burning your brassieres in the front yard?" "Perhaps I will," I said, my voice shaking but my gaze steady. His smile vanished. He took a step toward me. "Let me make something very clear to you," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing whisper. "You have a very comfortable life here. A life that I provide. You do nothing. You produce nothing. Your entire existence is funded by my hard work. For years, I have tolerated your moods, your emotional little dramas, your complete and utter lack of contribution to anything meaningful. You have been useless for years, a piece of decorative furniture. But you are my furniture, and you will not be excruciatingly bored on my dime. Do you understand me? Useless. A piece of decorative furniture." The words hit me, but they didn't hurt. It was as if he had finally spoken the truth that had been lurking beneath every critical glance, every dismissive sigh for decades. He had finally given me the full, unvarnished text of my own life story as written by him. And in doing so, he had set me free. I didn't answer him. I just looked at him, at this stranger with the cold eyes and the expensive tie. And I felt nothing. The rage was gone. The hurt was gone. There was only a vast, cold emptiness. I nodded, a single, tiny nod. He took that as submission. He gave a satisfied grunt, turned, and left the kitchen. A moment later, I heard the front door close. I stood there for a long time. Then I moved. I walked upstairs, not to our bedroom, but to the guest room. I pulled the shoebox out from under the bed. It held $287.42. I put the box in my handbag. I went in my old room, Sarah's room, and took the small watercolor set from the closet shelf. I packed a small suitcase. Underwear, 2 pairs of slacks, a few sweaters, my comfortable shoes. I took the framed photo of Sarah and Daniel as children from my bedside table. I left behind the jewelry he had given me, the expensive clothes, the cashmere coats. They were not mine. They were part of the costume. As I walked down the stairs, handbag on my shoulder, suitcase in my hand, I took one last look around. The house was perfect. Silent, gleaming, a magazine-ready spread of upper-middle-class success. It was a beautiful hollow shell. I felt no nostalgia, no sadness. I felt like a visitor who had overstayed her welcome and was finally, quietly, seeing herself out. I walked into the garage, got into the 10-year-old station wagon that was my car, and backed out of the driveway. I didn't look back. I drove for an hour, aimlessly at first, the rain slicking the roads. Then I got on the interstate and headed south, towards a town I'd only ever seen on a map, a place far enough away that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew. I found a motel for the first night. The room smelled of stale smoke and bleach. I lay on the lumpy bed, fully clothed, and stared at the water-stained ceiling. I was terrified, but I was also breathing. For the first time in years, I felt like I was actually breathing. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. My $287 disappeared with frightening speed. I found a small, dreary apartment above a laundromat. The rent was cheap, but the walls were paper-thin, and the whole place smelled of damp and dryer sheets. I sold the station wagon for a pittance, enough for a security deposit and 2 months' rent. I was now truly on foot, a pedestrian in a world built for cars. And then I had to find a job. My library searches had been right. My options were slim. I filled out applications at grocery stores, at drugstores, at fast food chains. I was met with polite disinterest. I was too old. I had no work history. I was a ghost. Finally, out of desperation, I walked into a 24-hour diner called The Corner Spot. It was a classic place, with red vinyl booths and a long Formica counter. It smelled of grease, coffee, and despair. The owner, a tired-looking man named Sal, looked at my application, looked at me, and shrugged. "Can you start tomorrow morning? 6 a.m. shift. Don't be late." And so Margaret Thompson, former lady of a grand suburban house, became Marge, the new waitress at the Corner Spot. It was a brutal education. My feet ached constantly. My back felt like it was going to snap in two. I, who had orchestrated complex dinner parties, couldn't seem to master the art of carrying 3 plates at once. I struggled with the computer system for taking orders. I was slow, clumsy, forgetful. The other waitresses, women my daughter's age, were kind but impatient. The customers were a blur of faces, some kind, some indifferent, some openly rude. I was invisible again, but in a new way. I wasn't decorative furniture. I was a function, a pair of hands to bring coffee and clear plates. One Saturday morning, during the peak of the breakfast rush, it happened. The diner was a cacophony of clattering dishes, shouting cooks, and hungry customers. I was exhausted. I had been on my feet for 5 hours. I was carrying a tray with 2 coffees and a glass of orange juice. A child darted out from a booth, and I stumbled, trying to avoid him. The tray tilted. The entire contents, hot coffee, sticky orange juice, spilled directly onto the lap of a man in a crisp, expensive-looking business suit who was sitting at the counter. He leaped to his feet with a roar of fury. "Are you an idiot?" he shouted, brushing at his soaked trousers. "This is a $2,000 suit. Look what you've done." The entire diner fell silent. Every eye was on me. My face burned with shame. I dropped the now empty tray with a clatter. "I'm so sorry, sir. I'm so sorry," I stammered, grabbing a handful of napkins and dropping to my knees to try and sop up the mess on the floor. "Sorry doesn't cut it," he bellowed, standing over me. "I have a meeting in an hour. You're incompetent. You should be fired." He was right. I was incompetent. I was old and tired and useless. The word echoed in my head. Useless. Richard's word. The man's polished black shoe was inches from my hand. I felt a primal, gut-wrenching fear that he was going to lash out, that he was going to kick me, right there on the dirty, sticky floor of the diner. All the humiliation, all the exhaustion, all the years of being made to feel small and worthless, coalesced into a single, desperate plea. I looked up at him, my eyes swimming with tears, my whole body trembling. My voice was a choked whisper, a sound that came from that deep, buried place of pain. "Please," I begged, the words tumbling out of me, raw and unfiltered. "Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt. The man in the suit froze, his face a mask of shocked fury. The silence in the diner was absolute, thick and heavy. And in that silence, a new voice cut through the air. A familiar voice. "Mom?" I slowly turned my head, my gaze traveling from the angry man's shoes up past the counter to a booth by the window. A young man was standing there, his own breakfast forgotten. He was wearing a suit, not unlike the one I had just ruined. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified recognition. It was my son. It was Daniel. Time seemed to fracture in that moment. My son's voice, saying that single, questioning word, "Mom," was a stone thrown into the frozen pond of my humiliation. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick with the things that could now never be unsaid or unseen. I was still on my knees on the dirty linoleum, a pathetic tableau of failure. My gaze, filled with a lifetime of unshed tears, finally met Daniel's across the diner. I saw in his face a series of rapid, colliding emotions. First, simple disbelief, as if his brain could not reconcile the image of his mother, the elegant, poised hostess of 1,000 dinner parties, with the trembling, weeping woman in a cheap, stained uniform. Then a wave of dawning horror as the scene replayed in his mind through the new lens of her being his mother. The man yelling. My desperate, whispered plea. Finally, a hot flush of shame, so profound it was almost visible. It wasn't just shame for me, but shame for himself, for being a witness, for being a part of a world that could bring his mother to this. The man in the suit, the one whose fury had been a physical force just seconds before, seemed to shrink. He looked from my face to Daniel's, who was now striding towards us, his own suit a stark, terrible echo of the one I had ruined. The man's bluster evaporated, replaced by a confused, defensive stammer. She, the coffee, he mumbled, looking around as if for an escape from a situation that had suddenly become deeply, horribly personal. Daniel didn't even look at him. His eyes were locked on me. He reached down, his hands strong and firm, and gently took my arms. "Mom, get up," he said, his voice low and strained. He pulled me to my feet. I felt unsteady, like a newborn foal. My apron was smeared with coffee, my hands were sticky with juice. I was a mess, a walking disaster, and I was standing in front of my successful, handsome son who I had not seen in nearly 6 months. Sal, the owner, came bustling out from behind the counter, a dish towel in his hand. "Hey, what's going on here?" "Marge, you okay?" he asked, his tired eyes full of genuine concern. "She's my mother," Daniel said, the words coming out clipped and harsh, an indictment of everyone in the room. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and threw several $100 bills onto the counter. "This is for the suit, for the trouble, for everything. We're leaving." He began to steer me toward the door, his hand of ice on my arm. It was a rescue. It was the way a man like my son, a man like my husband, solved a problem, with money and a swift, decisive exit that prevented any further mess. But as we reached the door, I stopped. I pulled my arm from his grip. "Daniel, no," I said. My voice was still shaky, but a sliver of the hardness I had found on the day I left had returned. I turned and looked back at Sal, who was staring at the money on his counter as if it were a snake. I walked back to him, my aching feet protesting every step. I took one of the $100 bills and pushed it into the hand of the man whose suit I had stained. "This should be more than enough to cover the cleaning," I said, my voice gaining strength. I took another bill and gave it to Sal. "I'm sorry for the disturbance, Sal. And this is for my last week." I quit. Then I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving my son and the 2 stunned men behind. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was not going to be rescued. I had not come this far, I had not endured this much, only to be bundled into my son's expensive car and taken care of, to become his problem, his charity case, a secret shame to be managed. The rain had stopped. The November air was cold and damp and clean. I walked down the block, my lungs heaving, and sat down on a wet bench at a bus stop. I didn't know if I had bus fare. I didn't know anything. A moment later, Daniel's car, a sleek, dark gray sedan that probably cost more than I had earned in my entire life, pulled up to the curb. He got out and came over to the bench, leaving the passenger door open for me. He didn't sit down. He stood over me, just as the man in the diner had. "Mom, what are you doing?" he pleaded, his voice a mixture of anger and bewilderment. "Get in the car. We're going to get you a hotel room, get you some decent clothes. We'll figure this out." I looked up at him. I saw Richard's son. I saw the man who had told me to join a book club. The man who had been more concerned with his father's reputation than his mother's misery. "Figure what out, Daniel?" I asked, my voice quiet. "Figure out how to hide me? How to clean up this embarrassing mess before anyone from your world finds out?" He flinched as if I had struck him. "No, that's not." "Mom, why are you here? In this place? Working in that? Dad said you went to visit your sister in Florida." "Of course." The lie. The neat, tidy story to explain my absence. The narrative had been framed, the problem contained. "I don't have a sister, Daniel," I said flatly. "You know that. Your father lied to you because the truth was inconvenient." "The truth?" he asked, throwing his hands up in exasperation. "What is the truth? That you ran away from home like a teenager because you were in a slump." The words, his words from our last phone call, hung in the cold air between us. I stood up so that I was no longer looking up at him. We were almost eye to eye. "No, Daniel. The truth is that your father, for 40 years, treated me not as a partner, but as an employee he couldn't fire. The truth is he told me I was useless, a piece of decorative furniture. He said my entire existence was funded by him, and that I contributed nothing of meaning. He said it to my face in our kitchen because I bought the wrong kind of coffee. Do you understand? The wrong coffee." I watched his face as the words landed. I saw the confident set of his jaw slacken, the certainty in his eyes flicker and die, replaced by a dawning, sickening understanding. He remembered. He had to remember. The 1,000 tiny humiliations he had witnessed but never processed. The way his father spoke to me. The way I would flinch. I left, I continued, my voice gaining a power I didn't know I possessed, because I realized I would rather be on my knees cleaning up spilled coffee for a stranger than spend one more day being silently, politely, and expertly destroyed in that beautiful, perfect house. "The hurt you saw in there," I said, gesturing back toward the diner. The reason I said I'm already hurt was not because of that man. It was because of your father. It was the hurt of 1,000 days, 1,000,000 moments of being made to feel worthless. I didn't run away from home, Daniel. I ran for my life. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. All the fight, all the righteous indignation had drained out of him. He looked like a little boy, lost and confused. He finally sank down onto the bench beside me. He said you were useless, he whispered, the words sounding obscene in his own mouth. I nodded, the tears I'd held back in the diner now tracking silently down my cold cheeks. Among other things, he put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Oh, God, Mom. I'm so sorry. I didn't. I never. I hurt him sometimes, but I just thought that was just how they were. I didn't see it. I'm so sorry." We sat there in silence for a long time on that wet bench, a mother and son adrift in the wreckage of a family's secret history. He, for the first time, was seeing the truth. And I, for the first time, was being truly seen by him. It was a terrible, painful, and profoundly beautiful moment. Just as he was starting to speak again, to offer help in a new, humbler tone, another man approached our bench. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with kind eyes and a face that showed a life of both thought and experience. He was dressed well, but conservatively. I recognized him instantly. He had been sitting in the corner booth of the diner, the one by the window, quietly reading a newspaper through the whole ordeal. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and respectful. He was speaking to me, not to Daniel. "I don't mean to intrude. My name is Arthur Vance. I couldn't help but overhear, well, everything, both in there and out here." He gestured vaguely between the diner and our bench. Daniel immediately went on the defensive, standing up. "Look, we don't need any." The man, Arthur, held up a hand, a calming gesture. "I'm not here to cause trouble, son. I'm here to talk to your mother, if she'll allow it." I looked at him, intrigued despite myself. There was a gentleness in his demeanor that was utterly foreign to me. I nodded. "It's all right, Daniel." Arthur Vance looked at me, his gaze direct and serious. "Ma'am, your name is Margaret, isn't it? I heard your son." I nodded again. "Margaret, what I saw in that diner was a disgrace. The way that man spoke to you is unacceptable. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of what you did. You maintained your dignity under extreme provocation. You apologized sincerely for an accident. And when you were brought to your knees, you spoke a truth so powerful it silenced an entire room." And then, he continued, a small smile touching his lips, "You got up. You refused to be a victim. You paid your dues, and you walked out on your own terms. In the space of 5 minutes, you showed more character and integrity than I've seen in most boardrooms in a year." I was stunned into silence. He was describing my moment of ultimate humiliation as a moment of strength. He was reframing my story, not just for Daniel, but for me. "I am the CEO of a small chain of boutique hotels," he went on, as if it were a minor detail. "The Vance Collection. We have a new property opening in the city in 3 months. We pride ourselves on a level of guest service that is intuitive, compassionate, and deeply personal. It's not something you can easily teach. It's a quality of character. It's the ability to anticipate a need, to solve a problem with grace, to make a person feel seen and cared for. It's everything you demonstrated this morning." Daniel and I were both staring at him, speechless. "I have a position," Arthur Vance said, "for a director of guest experience. It's a senior role. It involves training staff, managing difficult situations, and essentially being the heart and soul of the hotel for our guests. It requires impeccable organizational skills, grace under pressure, an intuitive understanding of people, and a core of inner strength. The pay is substantial, and it comes with a furnished apartment in the hotel for the first 6 months, until you get on your feet." He paused, his kind eyes holding mine. "I know this is unorthodox, but I am an excellent judge of character. It's the foundation of my business. I believe you are uniquely qualified for this role, Margaret. The job is yours if you want it." The world tilted on its axis. An undercover CEO. It was the stuff of fantasy, of internet fables. And yet, here he was. Here I was. A job. A real job. An apartment. A future. It was a lifeline, a golden rope thrown down into the pit I had been crawling in. Daniel looked at me, his eyes wide with hope, ready to accept on my behalf. But I had learned something in that diner, on that floor. I had found my voice. I looked at this kind man, this impossible savior. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice steady. "Why? Why me?" "You don't know me. I have no experience. I'm 62 years old. My entire resume for the last 40 years is a house in the suburbs." He smiled again, a genuine, warm smile. "Your resume is 40 years of running a complex domestic enterprise. You've been a project manager, a chief financial officer, a logistics coordinator, a counselor, and a crisis negotiator, all without a salary and with very little appreciation, from what I can gather. As for why you? Because my mother was a woman very much like you. She poured her entire brilliant life into a man who didn't deserve her and a family that took her for granted. She never got the chance to see what else she could have been. I see her in you. And I think it's time you got your chance. The offer is real. No strings attached." I looked at Daniel, who was watching me, his expression unreadable. I looked at the offer, this incredible, impossible escape route. And I looked inside myself. For the first time, the choice was not between staying and leaving. It was between 2 different futures, both of which were mine to claim. One, going with Daniel, being cared for, loved, but still dependent. The other, a terrifying, exhilarating leap into the unknown, standing on my own 2 feet. I took a deep breath. "Mr. Vance," I said. "Arthur, when do I start?" The next year of my life was a whirlwind. I moved into the beautiful, small apartment at the top of the new hotel. It was clean, modern, and anonymous, and I loved it more than I had ever loved the grand house in Ohio. It was mine. I bought a coffee maker and filled my cupboards with hazelnut-flavored coffee. I bought a small set of watercolors, and on my days off, I would sit by the window that overlooked the city and I would paint. They weren't very good, but they were mine. The job was harder than I could have imagined. I had to learn about computer systems and budgets and employee management. There were days I felt like a fraud, like the clumsy waitress from the corner spot, and I was sure Arthur would realize he'd made a terrible mistake. But he never did. He was a patient mentor, and he had been right. The core of the job, the human part, came naturally to me. I knew how to listen. I knew how to soothe a frayed nerve. I knew how to make people feel comfortable and valued. I had been doing it my whole life. The only difference was that now I was being paid for it. I was being respected for it. Daniel and I rebuilt our relationship from the ground up. He called me every week, not to check on me, but to talk. He told me he had confronted Richard. It had not gone well. Richard, as expected, denied everything, accused me of being hysterical, and accused Daniel of being disloyal. They barely spoke anymore. Richard was alone now in his perfect, silent house, a king in an empty castle. I felt a pang of something for him, not love, not pity, but a distant, abstract sadness for a life so small, so walled in by its own pride. Sarah was ecstatic. She came to visit me in my new apartment, and we cried and laughed and drank hazelnut coffee until late into the night. "I knew you had it in you, Mom," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm so proud of you." To be her peer, her equal, was the greatest gift of all. One evening, about a year after I started my new life, I was standing in the lobby of the hotel. It was a beautiful space, all clean lines and soft lighting, and it was humming with the quiet, happy energy of guests. I wasn't Margaret Thompson, Richard's wife. I wasn't Marge, the clumsy waitress. I was Miss Thompson, the director of guest experience. I wore a simple, elegant black dress and comfortable, stylish shoes. My name was on a small, tasteful brass plaque on my office door. I had my own bank account, my own keys to my own home, my own life. I looked at my reflection in the polished glass of the front doors. I saw a woman with graying hair and lines around her eyes, lines of laughter and of sorrow. I saw a woman who was no longer invisible. The piece of cloth that was my life was no longer being woven by someone else in a dark room. I was at the loom now. The pattern was intricate, and some of the threads were dark and stained with pain, but they were woven through with bright, strong threads of my own choosing. The windows were no longer painted over. They were wide open, and the view, for the first time in a very long time, was entirely my own. And it was beautiful.